I've always believed in personal growth and exploring who you really are, especially when you feel trapped in a routine that's slowly killing your soul. My name is Lana. I'm 35. And I was married to this truck driver named Ethan, who thought our boring little life was perfectly fine just because the bills got paid and we had a decent house. He's one of those guys who thinks stability equals happiness, which is honestly pretty naive when you think about it. Like, congratulations. You can make mortgage payments, but what about actually living? The whole thing started when my sister Sabrina moved back to town after her second divorce. Now, I know people love to blame Sabrina for everything that happened, but that's just because they can't handle a woman who refuses to settle for mediocrity. Sabrina has actually lived, she's traveled, she's had experiences, she's figured out what she wants instead of just accepting whatever boring existence gets handed to her. When she started telling me about all the places she'd been and the interesting people she'd met, it made me realize how much I'd been limiting myself by staying in this little bubble with Ethan. Don't get me wrong, Ethan's not a bad guy. He's just incredibly limited in his thinking. He's been driving trucks for 12 years, and he acts like that's some kind of achievement instead of just doing the same repetitive job over and over. He'd leave for days at a time, come home tired, and expect me to be thrilled about watching movies and going camping like we were still 25. Meanwhile, I'm working at this soul-crushing insurance job, dealing with the same boring claims day after day, feeling like my life is just slipping away while he's perfectly content with our little routine. Sabrina helped me see that I was selling myself short. She'd come over while Ethan was on the road, and we'd talk about relationships and personal growth and what it really means to be fulfilled as a woman. She introduced me to all these lifestyle influencers who were living these amazing lives, traveling to Bali and having these incredible experiences, and I started following them on Instagram. It was inspiring. Honestly, seeing women who refuse to be limited by other people's narrow definitions of what their lives should look like. That's when I started realizing how much Ethan's attitude was holding me back. He'd make these little comments about my new interests, rolling his eyes when I talked about personal development, or dismissing the women I was following as if their success somehow threatened him. He got all weird when I started questioning whether our routine was actually making us happy, or if we were just going through the motions because it felt safe. Like, God forbid I want something more meaningful than coming home to dirty dishes and yard work every weekend. The insurance job was literally killing my creativity and sense of purpose. So I made the decision to quit and take some time to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. Ethan acted like this was some kind of crisis instead of a positive step toward personal growth. He kept asking what my plan was, as if every life decision has to be mapped out like one of his boring truck routes. Sometimes you need space to explore your options and see what opportunities present themselves, instead of just settling for the first steady paycheck that comes along. I tried explaining that I needed time to express myself and figure out what kind of work would actually fulfill me, but he just didn't get it. He's so focused on practical things like savings accounts and retirement planning that he can't understand the importance of spiritual and emotional development. I mean, what's the point of saving money for the future if you're miserable in the present? That's not really living. That's just existing. While I was taking this time for self-discovery, I started spending more time with Sabrina, having these long brunches where we'd talk about life and relationships and what we really wanted. It was during one of these conversations that she introduced me to some of her friends, including this guy Blake, who was a CrossFit instructor. Blake had actually quit his corporate job to follow his passion for fitness and helping people transform their lives, which I found really inspiring. Here was someone who had the courage to leave a boring office job and do something that actually mattered to him. Blake and I started talking more, and I realized how refreshing it was to have conversations with someone who understood the importance of personal growth and wasn't threatened by a woman who wanted more out of life. He'd actually listen when I talked about my dreams and goals, instead of just nodding and changing the subject to something practical, like home repairs or grocery shopping. We had this connection that I hadn't felt in years. This intellectual and emotional compatibility that made me realize how much I'd been settling in my marriage. That's when I started thinking seriously about what I really wanted from my relationship with Ethan. We'd been together for 10 years, married for 7. And honestly, we'd just fallen into this comfortable routine that wasn't really serving either of us. I loved him, but I wasn't sure I was still in love with him. And I definitely wasn't growing as a person in our current dynamic. I started reading about different relationship models and realized that maybe the problem wasn't that I was unhappy, but that we were limiting ourselves to this traditional monogamous structure that doesn't really work for everyone. I discovered all this research about ethical non-monogamy and how couples can actually strengthen their relationship by exploring connections with other people. It made so much sense when I thought about it. Why should one person be expected to meet all of your needs? Why should personal growth stop just because you're married? These are questions that most people are too scared to ask because they're trapped in these outdated ideas about what relationships should look like. The more I learned about open relationships, the more I realized this could be exactly what Ethan and I needed. We could stay committed to each other while also having the freedom to explore other connections and grow as individuals. I knew it would be a difficult conversation, but I believed that if we approached it with honesty and maturity, it could actually make our marriage stronger. When I finally brought it up with Ethan, I tried to frame it in terms of personal growth and new experiences for both of us. I explained that I thought we'd gotten stuck in a rut, and that exploring other relationships could bring new energy and excitement into our lives. I was careful to emphasize that this wasn't about not loving him, but about expanding our capacity for connection and intimacy. His reaction was pretty typical for someone who's never really examined their assumptions about relationships. He got defensive and started talking about vows and loyalty, as if personal growth somehow violated our marriage contract. I tried to explain that this was actually about being more honest and authentic with each other, not about cheating or lying. We'd have complete transparency about who we were seeing, and we'd still prioritize our marriage above everything else. What surprised me was that after we talked about it for a while, he actually agreed to try it. I think deep down he knew that our relationship needed something to shake it up, even if he couldn't admit it directly. Maybe he was curious about exploring other connections too. Or maybe he just realized that trying to control me wasn't going to work long term. Either way, I was excited that we were finally going to break out of our boring routine and start really living. I decided to start slowly by going to this social event at Blake's gym. It wasn't technically a date, just a group of people hanging out and getting to know each other. But it felt amazing to be in an environment where people were focused on self-improvement and pushing their boundaries. Blake and I ended up talking for hours about fitness and personal development and what it means to live authentically. He had this energy and passion that I'd been missing in my life, and I could tell he was attracted to my intelligence and ambition. Over the next few weeks, Blake and I started spending more time together. We'd go to coffee shops and talk about books and philosophy, or he'd take me to these healthy restaurants where we'd discuss nutrition and wellness. It was exactly the kind of intellectual stimulation I'd been craving. He understood my journey in a way that Ethan never could because Blake had also made the choice to prioritize personal fulfillment over financial security. The physical attraction was undeniable too. Blake took care of his body in a way that showed real discipline and self-respect, and being around him made me feel more alive and attractive than I had in years. When we finally became intimate, it felt like this incredible expression of freedom and authenticity. This was what I'd been missing. This passion and excitement and sense of really connecting with someone on every level. Meanwhile, Ethan was acting strange about the whole arrangement. I'd tell him about my dates with Blake, and he'd just nod and say, okay, like he didn't even care what I was doing. Part of me wondered if he was seeing someone too and just not telling me about it. But honestly, I was too focused on my own growth to worry too much about what he was up to. If he wanted to explore other connections, that was exactly what we'd agreed on. The weird thing was that instead of being happy that I was finally coming alive again, Ethan seemed to be pulling away emotionally. He'd come home from his routes and just go straight to the garage to work on his stupid project cars, instead of wanting to hear about the interesting people I was meeting or the new things I was learning about myself. It was like he was punishing me for actually taking advantage of the freedom we'd agreed to explore. Things got really tense when this neighbor Claire started flirting with Ethan more obviously. I'd always known she had a thing for him. The way she'd find excuses to chat with him when he was working on his truck. But now she was being much more direct about it. She'd text him about neighborhood events and make these comments about how she'd heard we had some kind of arrangement. Like she was fishing for information about whether he was available. What bothered me wasn't that Claire was interested in Ethan, but that she was being so calculating about it. She'd obviously been waiting for an opportunity like this, and now she was trying to take advantage of our open marriage to get closer to him. That felt different from what Blake and I had, which was based on genuine connection and mutual growth. Claire was just some lonely neighbor who saw a chance to insert herself into our lives. I tried to explain to Ethan why the Claire situation was problematic. Blake and I had met through mutual interests and personal development activities. Our connection was based on shared values and intellectual compatibility. But Claire had been harboring feelings for Ethan for years, which meant any relationship between them would be built on her old crush, rather than genuine exploration of new connections. That could get messy and complicated in ways that would actually threaten our marriage instead of enhancing it. Ethan didn't seem to understand the distinction, which honestly wasn't surprising given how black and white his thinking tends to be. He kept acting like I was being hypocritical, as if there was no difference between a mature exploration of new relationships and someone trying to capitalize on old attractions. I wasn't trying to control him. I was trying to protect both of us from unnecessary drama with people in our immediate social circle. The whole thing came to a head when Claire invited us to some neighborhood barbecue and Ethan decided to go, even though I said I wasn't comfortable with it. I felt like he was deliberately trying to provoke me, instead of having a mature conversation about boundaries. When he came home that night, I could tell something had shifted in his attitude. He was being distant and cold, like he was angry with me for having reasonable concerns about Claire's motivations. That's when I realized that maybe Ethan wasn't as committed to making our open marriage work as he'd claimed to be. Instead of focusing on his own growth and exploration, he seemed more interested in punishing me for finding happiness with Blake. He'd make these passive-aggressive comments about my relationship and act like I was doing something wrong by actually embracing the freedom we'd agreed to explore together. I started to suspect that he'd never really wanted an open marriage at all. Maybe he'd just agreed to it because he thought I'd changed my mind, or because he wanted to make me feel guilty for wanting something more than our boring routine. That felt manipulative and dishonest, especially since I'd been completely transparent about my feelings and my relationship with Blake from the beginning. The situation got even more complicated when my sister started getting involved. Sabrina could see that Ethan was being weird and unsupportive about my personal growth, and she tried to talk to him about what I was going through. She explained that this was a normal part of a woman's journey towards self-discovery, and that he should be proud that I was brave enough to explore who I really was, instead of just settling for mediocrity. But Ethan didn't want to hear it. He was so locked into his traditional ideas about marriage that he couldn't see how this experience was actually making me a better, more authentic person. Instead of celebrating my growth, he was treating it like some kind of betrayal, which honestly said more about his insecurities than anything I was doing wrong. Things finally exploded when Blake came over to the house one evening while Ethan was supposed to be on the road. We weren't doing anything inappropriate, just having some wine and talking. But when Ethan came home unexpectedly, he completely lost it. He started making all these accusations about bringing Blake into our home and violating some rule that I don't even remember agreeing to. He was acting like I'd committed some terrible crime instead of just spending time with someone I cared about in a space where I had every right to be. The whole confrontation was honestly embarrassing. Here I was, trying to have a mature adult relationship based on honesty and growth. And Ethan was throwing this tantrum like some kind of jealous teenager. He started making all these claims about the house being his property, and acting like I didn't have equal rights to invite friends over just because his name was on the deed. It was this ugly, possessive behavior that showed me how little he actually respected me as an equal partner. What really hurt was that he humiliated me in front of Blake, who could see exactly what kind of controlling dynamic I'd been dealing with. Blake ended up leaving because the whole scene was so uncomfortable, and I felt like Ethan had deliberately sabotaged something beautiful just because he couldn't handle my happiness. That's when I realized that our marriage probably wasn't going to survive his inability to accept my personal growth. The next few months were a nightmare of legal battles and financial manipulation. Ethan hired this lawyer, who helped him hide assets and make it look like I hadn't contributed anything to our household, which was completely unfair, since I'd been the one managing our social life and creating a warm, welcoming home environment. Just because I hadn't been focused on traditional domestic tasks didn't mean I hadn't been contributing to our partnership in important ways. The whole divorce process revealed how vindictive Ethan could be when he didn't get his way. He used his financial advantages and the fact that the house was in his name to basically force me out of the life we'd built together. He had security cameras installed to spy on me and recorded private conversations with my sister, which felt like a huge violation of trust and privacy. This was not the man I'd married. This controlling, manipulative person who would go to such lengths to punish me for wanting to grow as a person. The worst part was how everyone took his side without really understanding what had happened. People heard that I'd wanted an open marriage and immediately assumed I was the villain. Like wanting to explore other connections automatically makes you a bad person. Nobody wanted to hear about the years of emotional neglect and boring routine that had driven me to look for something more meaningful. They just saw the surface situation and decided I was selfish for not being satisfied with the basic security Ethan provided. Even Blake started pulling away once things got complicated with the divorce. I guess he wasn't as committed to authentic connection as he'd claimed when things were easy and fun. It hurt to realize that someone I'd thought really understood me was actually just looking for a casual situation without any real depth or commitment. Maybe Sabrina was right that men just aren't capable of the kind of emotional growth that women naturally seek. Now I'm starting over at 35, which honestly feels liberating, even though it's scary. I'm living with Sabrina temporarily while I figure out my next steps. And even though money is tight, I feel like I'm finally free to become who I'm really meant to be. I'm not going to apologize for wanting more out of life than just paying bills and mowing lawns. I'm not going to pretend that settling for mediocrity is somehow virtuous just because it's comfortable. The whole experience taught me that most people are terrified of real authenticity and growth. They'd rather stay trapped in boring, safe routines than risk exploring what could make them truly happy. Ethan was so threatened by my willingness to push boundaries and question assumptions that he chose to destroy our marriage rather than grow alongside me. That's his loss, not mine. I know there are people who think I should have been satisfied with what I had, but those people have probably never felt truly alive or passionate about anything. They've never experienced the kind of connection I had with Blake. Even if it didn't last, they've never pushed themselves to grow beyond the limitations other people try to impose on them. I'd rather be alone and authentic than married and slowly dying inside. Sure, the divorce didn't go the way I hoped it would financially. And starting over isn't easy, but I'm proud of myself for having the courage to pursue what I really wanted instead of just accepting what felt safe. Most women my age would never have the guts to blow up their comfortable lives in search of something more meaningful. They'd just stay married to their boring husbands and wonder what they'd missed out on. I'm already meeting new people and exploring new possibilities. There's this guy at the coffee shop where I've been working part-time who seems really interesting and creative. He's a musician, which is so much more inspiring than truck driving or whatever other mundane jobs most men settle for. We've had some really deep conversations about art and passion and what it means to live an authentic life. Maybe things with this new guy will develop into something, or maybe they won't. But either way, I'm open to whatever the universe has in store for me. I'm not going to limit myself to other people's narrow definitions of what my life should look like. I'm not going to apologize for wanting passion and growth and real connection instead of just security and routine. The funny thing is that I heard through some mutual friends that Ethan is already dating someone new. Apparently it's that neighbor Claire, which honestly doesn't surprise me at all. She probably swooped in the minute she heard about our divorce, thinking she'd finally gotten her chance with him. Good luck to her dealing with his controlling tendencies and boring lifestyle. She'll probably think it's wonderful for about 6 months until she realizes how limited and predictable he really is. I'm sure they're very happy together, in their little bubble of conventional thinking and safe choices. Claire always struck me as the type who'd be satisfied with basic suburban life and weekend trips to Home Depot. She probably thinks getting a steady guy with a house is like winning the lottery, which just shows how low her standards really are. Sometimes I wonder if Ethan ever thinks about what we could have had if he'd been brave enough to grow with me instead of trying to keep me trapped in his comfort zone. We could have had this amazing journey of exploration and discovery together, but he was too scared and insecure to handle a woman who wanted more than just the basics. That's really sad when you think about it, but I'm not dwelling on the past anymore. I'm focused on building a life that actually fulfills me, surrounded by people who understand the importance of personal growth and authentic living. I'm finally free to become the person I was always meant to be, without someone else's limitations holding me back. And honestly, it feels like the greatest gift I could have given myself.